Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. Today Simone and I talk about losing the most significant man in her life. She dealt with the loss of her life partner through cancer, followed by the sudden death of her father and the dissolution of 2 marriages. After all these losses, she investigated into the masculine and she found an appreciation for the male aspect in her life and in herself. She describes the experience of grief's intensity in the following way.
The pain and intensity of it has not lessened in those moments. Yes, they're fewer and further between, but it's okay now because I know that it comes up like a huge wave and it feels so overwhelming in the moment, but I know that it's going to leave now, so it doesn't, topple me over. But I'm still always it's almost like impressed that level of grief does not abate when it comes up.
Simone Surgener is a therapist and mentor who has helped thousands of people find their own authentic path in life. She enjoys nothing more than exploring the depth of what it means to be human. Using herself as her own guinea pig, Simone demonstrates beingness as arising from integrity with one's essence. Helping people find their inner truth through their own direct experience is the core of Simone's work. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. So welcome, Simone. It's so nice to have you on the podcast. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
It's so nice to see you again. And we've known each other for quite some years, but haven't seen each other for many years, as we just discussed before recording. But how about we start with you telling us a little bit about your life and your losses and your trauma that occurred in your life?
Sure. So losses appeared in many different forms in my life. I've had more than one friend say to me, I signed up for a very interesting life. And I say this and I don't say it in a blasé way, but for me, my experience of life by this stage, I'm 49, I'll be 50 in 6 months, and it's just been like a continual stripping away, which has been excruciating at times. And I can say that now, even though it's still not always pleasant, it's something I've actually become quite used to and quite grateful for. But I'd have to say there was, a good 15 years there that were quite brutal. So I've got 4 daughters. I've got 2 adult daughters, 24 and 22. They don't live with me any longer. And that's from my first marriage of 16 years. So I'd have to say probably one of the first really intense experiences of grief and loss, and it was around losing that marriage. And then I've got 2 younger daughters who live with me. They're 10 and 12, and they're with me full time, and I unschool them. And we lost their father, my partner, the big love of my life, 7 years ago, actually, this Saturday. So I found it really interesting that you invited me to be on your podcast, and then I sort of realised it was so close to Nick's passing and the anniversary. So, I felt it was actually quite beautiful, but I'm kind of feeling that potency of the loss as I naturally do around this time.
That touches me. We can see it as like a celebration of his life.
Yeah. And so we lost him to cancer. He was 9 years younger than me, so he was quite young at the time. He was, I'm a bit hazy on details now, 36 when he died. And I mean, he was sick for a year and a half. Well, I mean, a bit longer, but a year and a half from diagnosis. But 6 weeks before he died, my dad died unexpectedly in his sleep, just heart attack in his sleep, which was totally unexpected. My dad was very healthy. He was renovating his house, and so that was a shock. So I lost the 2 most important men. I loved and adored my father. I had a really good, close relationship with him. So it was like my whole world, just like the whole masculine aspect of my world. The 2 most important men in my life died in a very short space of time together. So it was a very, very intense period.
Yeah, that sounds like already in a short couple of minutes that you spoke about those losses. It sounds like a lot. So I agree that this is quite some loss already, but then there was more.
Well, there's always more.
Or complications, let's call it this way.
Yeah. I mean, then I moved to America, and I can give a bit more background about that. But I moved to America, and I was in another relationship with a man quite a few decades older than me, and that was a very hard relationship, very complicated. He was quite controlling and abusive at times, and so I left that and came back to Australia, and that was a really interesting loss of a beautiful home and lifestyle that I'd always dreamed of, that he offered me over there. And I had to leave because the relationship wasn't healthy for myself and the kids. But then I experienced losing your dream and something really beautiful and a gorgeous home and, things that I didn't think I was particularly materialistic. And I'm not, but things that we value as stable and beautiful. We lived in 9 acres in the country, and I'm very, very much a nature person. And so, I came back here, and I was a single mum for the first time. I came back literally with no money, no car, nowhere to live, a couple of suitcases. It was sort of like it was a loss of just it felt like my whole life, just everything that I was, everything that I knew myself to be, every relationship, it just all disappeared, and I had no ground underneath me. And that was 3.5 years ago, almost 4 years. And that was probably harder than almost anything that I've ever done, because it was a whole loss of my values and things that I'd worked very hard for. I've worked very hard to be a stay-at-home mom and create community and village and be supportive of other mothers. My values, I'm not saying, other people make different choices, but, attachment parenting and, so many things that I couldn't do. Suddenly I have to be the provider and I can't be here for my children, and I had no business skills, and I had no income and no support. And I hit perimenopause at exactly the same time as well. So I felt a lack of inner resources. We know each other through the same modality, and I'd been a therapist, now for almost 20 years. And even as well resourced as I couldn't even draw on that. So it was like a real whole crumbling of my whole identity and self and who I was. And, for anyone who's been through perimenopause and menopause, it can be a really difficult time, and that's part of it, the burning away. And so I just found that was a great period of grieving myself, my whole life up until that point. I'd grieved loss of relationship and marriage, and I'd grieved loss, death and, my parent. But I'd have to say also grieving who I was up until that period was incredibly challenging. And so when we talk about grief, there's just so many different forms of it, and I'm happy to talk about all the different ways it appears.
Yeah, I think you have a beautiful in the sense of a nice list of different losses that I see in so many clients and so many people that I talk to, and not just the loss of a person through death, but the loss of as you said, of a relationship, of a separation, of meaning. And, loss for me, the way I describe it, is always about the meaning that thing, that person, that situation has for you in your life. And so the meaning determines the loss, and not the time that you spend together, but the meaning that it has. So let's have a look at those different losses if you want. I'm really interested. Maybe we'll start with those that are the most significant, or the first ones. Where would you like to start, just to unpack it a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll start with the deaths, because I think that that is a huge it's a huge ending. I can talk about loss of house and home, but there's always that sort of hope that you can rebuild it. One day I will rebuild my life. Death has a finality to it that is, I still to this day struggle with the finality of it, because there's still a part of me 7 years later that says, I can't believe I'm never going to see Nick again, that he's not just going to walk on the door.
Take a moment.
So yeah, like I think that there's a part of us that finds that level of loss almost unbelievable, and it's very hard to come to deal with it. There's a woman I've just recently found on Facebook, and I've been following her. Her name's Sophie Strand, and she's very much into plants and nature. And I read something of hers recently, and she said that, you know, some griefs can't actually be healed, that we have to learn to, you know, live with them. And I mean, I already knew that we had to live with them, but she described it like a tree and, like, you know, like a nail stuck in it or something's, you know, obstructing it, and the tree has to grow the bark around it. And so it becomes this sort of hybrid. You know, it's a tree with this thing in it. And so she describes, you know, who we are as humans and who we become as sometimes like, and, you know, it's almost like we living together and growing around each other. And that's been my experience of grief, in terms, at least with death, you know, the loss of a person. It's like you learn how to live with that level of loss. I don't know that you can necessarily heal it. And having said that, I'm someone who's done a lot of therapy on myself and helps others. And I've also done a lot of plant medicine, and that's not necessarily something we can have to go into now, but I found that working with plants, psychedelics, microdosing, macrodosing, that I've got a different appreciation of life than I had before. And that's kind of given me a different context.
The thing that you said before about the disbelief, I think many people, if not most, who have experienced the loss through death of someone can relate to that. Because even when you were just saying that, I can remember so many times when I sit here and think, my mother's dead. Is she really dead? And it's 10 years, so the time is not a reflection of belief getting any more. And just a few months ago, actually, I had a podcast with someone else, and the metaphor came to me. I didn't think about that before. I hadn't heard that before. For me, grief is like a child, and it grows up with me. And at the beginning, it requires a lot of time. It makes me sleepless and overwhelmed, like a baby. And after time, she sleeps through the night, and I have a bit of rest. But I still need to breastfeed her every few hours. That grief still needs my attention ever so often. And now my grief, because also in relation to my dead child, my grief is also 11 years old, just like my daughter who's turning 11 in a few weeks. And it's like, she's now so independent that she goes out on her own. But at times she comes back, and she's still the child, not the 11-year-old. She's still, Mommy, I need you. And so I realized that in a podcast where I thought, it's like a child. She will always be my child. My grief will always be part of me, and she grows up, and when it comes to the point, she might even move out. But she's still there, and she'll still come back at times and visit me and maybe need my support, or yeah.
No, that's a beautiful way of putting it. And I think anyone who's, you know, had experienced grief for a long time, one of the things that surprises me is that, yes, there's long, you know, I don't think about him every single day now, or, you know, multiple times a day. And, you know, there's gaps where he's not in my awareness. But those times when grief comes up again, you know, and I can't think of him without being upset. So that's, you know, lovely. But there's just times that grief will just come up, and the pain and intensity of it has not lessened in those moments. Yes, they're fewer and further between, but I'm actually, it's okay now, because I know that it comes up like a huge wave and it feels so overwhelming in the moment, but I know that it's going to leave now, so it doesn't, you know, topple me over. But I'm still always it's almost like impressed. Yeah. that level of grief does not abate when it comes up. It's, you know,
And I guess from your situation, now you also have the 10 and the 12-year-old who lost their father. So you are, I'm assuming, faced with some kind of progression of grief in them, of living or of growing up without a father.
Yeah.
Does that happen? How does that happen in your family?
It's interesting. They don't have much grief, and they don't really talk about him much anymore like they did when they were younger. For me, I actually think I grieve more for them, because sometimes I'll look at them and they'll be almost like, oh, I wish, Nick could look through my eyes. I see them wishing that he was here and he was witnessing the same thing. And then there's other times that I'm like, oh, I wish they got to share this with their father. I wish they could run in and say, or, show them, like something. And so I grieve for their loss and I grieve for his loss,
Mm-hmm.
It's a really, like interesting dynamic.
And in my case, I see the progression in Ananda May that she has gone through in terms of grieving her sister specifically. And I don't know, maybe it's because of her age. So in my case, it was that when she turned 4, it was the first time that I saw her grieving, or what I would term grieve. And that was not in relation to her sister. That was in relation to her birthday party being over. So it was the first time that she realized the fact that this is now over. And it will not happen again for another year. So, and it was really interesting because she was crying and I didn't know what was wrong. It was just really after the birthday party. And then she cried for about half an hour. And I was in the right place to let her and not appease her or not say, it's okay, you're going to have another one. I didn't say anything. I just let her have that. And about half an hour later, which was quite long, I thought, in the sense of I would have thought that it would faster, but I just let it be experienced. And then she said, okay, mommy, can we do something else now?
Mm.
And it's interesting. So later then it started with her sister, of her not having a sister. And she becomes more aware of friendships, and she has this imagination of going to school with her sister and having someone by her side who would always stick up for her. And that's her story, her narrative of not having her sister, right? Yeah. So I think that's the situation with her. I mean, your children obviously had some time with their father present, and so they know him more as growing up as opposed to not having someone at all.
They were very young. They were 3 and 5. The youngest doesn't really remember much.
Okay.
You said something interesting there where you said you were in the right place not to appease her, and that kind of made me think, like one of the things that I've had to be very compassionate with myself for is that I was in such a place of grief, not just losing Nick, but also losing my dad, and then in a relationship very, at the same time that, straight afterwards that was not the healthiest, that I wasn't always in a good place to know how to handle my kids' grief. I mean, I did a good job. I know, like, they're fine and they're healthy. But, what I was saying earlier about grieving myself and my loss of identity, and, I've had that multiple times in my life. But because I'd raised 2 children and I knew what kind of mother I was in a healthy, functional space that's stable, and, I'm being financially supported and I can be really present to my children, and, I knew what it was to be a really good present mother. Of course, I wasn't perfect. I made lots of mistakes, but to not be that, like to be very unstable and to have like so much overwhelming grief and stress, I wasn't always the best mum. And that was really, really difficult for me because, like, how do I support my children when I'm struggling to support myself? So I'm aware of the times that I wasn't there, to able to be present to my children in their grief and their loss as well.
How did you feel that overwhelm? How was that at that time with that intense grief?
Going back to when Nick and my dad died and I moved to America, I actually went for 2.5 months to Mexico, just for various reasons. And I lived there, and there was something quite healing about being there in the sunshine and being able to walk on the beach every single day. And then I was in Utah living there, and my kids went to a really, really beautiful little small independent school that was, had really beautiful values, and I knew they were well cared for. And I remember saying to myself, I'm going to give myself a year to solidly grieve, and I still like get quite emotional because I remember at that time it was so overwhelming that every single part of me craved, like in a way that I'd never felt before, like this really, really dark craving. I just wanted to go into the mountains because we lived 6,000 feet elevation. I just wanted to go into the mountains, like deep into the forest, a little log cabin, and live in that on my own. And I felt like I could howl nonstop for 5 years. Like that was just like, it was that intense. And of course I couldn't, I had children, and but every part of me just wanted to run away. And so I went, okay, I'm going to have to be functional. And so I thought, I'm going to give myself a year to grieve as intensely as I can within the context of a life and small children who are also grieving. And I made it okay to get up, take them to school, come back, get back into bed and cry. It was very hard because I was then in another relationship, and so he did not know how to handle my grief, and he did not want to see me crying. So I'd go for long walks and I'd cry on my walks and then come back and be normal or whatever that means. But I just made it okay that my kids had a roof over their head. They went to a beautiful school where they were lovingly nurtured, and they were well fed, and they had, we had plenty of nature, and their basic needs are being met, and that's all I can do at the moment.
Yeah.
They're healthy, happy, and safe. And
it's a good enough parent.
Yeah. And I just concentrated on grieving, and I went to some really dark places. And then a year came, and I was like, not that I expected to get it all out in 1 year, but I just went, okay, that's enough at that level, like that level of just like completely letting myself go in it. And so I kind of was like, okay, now it's time to reconsolidate myself, because I was also in a really difficult relationship. And it was funny because I knew that I had to deal with this relationship that was not good for me on many levels. But I consciously did this. I went, that has to go to the back of the line. Like I've got this grief to deal with my dad. I've got this grief to deal with Nick. I've got kids to look after. That's enough. I will deal with my, difficult, relationship down the track. And so then, after a year, it took me another 6 months to sort of like start to pull myself together. And I remember the feeling of that first year in grief, of feeling like an empty shell. I like literally just felt like a fragile eggshell, and there was nothing inside and there was nothing outside. There was just emptiness. And I just surrendered to that complete nothingness. And I couldn't find me. Like I understood why, people in grief would put on sackcloth. And, like I remember I just didn't want to wear anything of colour. And I didn't, like I was like, oh, this is why they wear, Greek widows wear black all the time, like just that feeling of like just being grey and nothing. And then I slowly started to go, okay, you're going to have to start to bring back some parts of you, like some. And I remember after a year going, it was this weird feeling of going, but I kind of liked the emptiness. Like there was a part of me that liked the nothingness. I didn't want to be me prior to these devastating, catastrophic deaths. And there was a bit of a freedom in that, of going, oh, I don't have to bring back all parts of me. I actually can choose. Like I can choose which parts of me I'm going to bring back, because it really was that like cracked me open so wide. And I started to slowly bring in certain parts of me that almost felt awkward, like I was pretending to be that old me,
Yeah.
But I also realized there's no way to be functional in society and with other people without, these different aspects of our personas. But I was very careful. So it took another sort of 6 months to sort of bring back some semblance of Simone. And then I got on to dealing with my relationship and moving on from that as well. And I say that it was there was abuse and there was a lot of control, but he also saved me. He gave me a home and a beautiful place in nature and supported us financially, and there was adventures and travel and like things that were very, very supportive at a time that I just wasn't functioning at all. So, there's a lot of gratitude. I went through forgiveness for him. I still speak to him every single day. He's in America, and so he's still part of our life.
The other thing that comes to mind, that I don't know if it came out in your story, I mean, those two losses were in Australia and you were in the States. Mm-hmm. So The
I was
location.
in Australia when they both passed.
Ah, you were in Australia.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was, yeah, because of visa requirements and everything, I was still spending quite a lot of time in Australia.
Okay. So you were present at that time.
Yeah.
But then being in a completely different environment and a completely different community, and probably not many people who then knew your family situation and your griefs, was that supportive or being more lonely as to not being in the same place as many of the friends and family members who were also grieving?
It was actually very supportive for me. It was hard for my older daughters because they remained here in Australia with their father. So there was that loss that we were both experiencing, and that was very, very hard for them. So I was kind of dealing with that at the time. And I'm not, I'm humble enough to admit that there was a part of me that ran away. Like, now I can look back 7 years later and say that was so overwhelming. I did run away, and yet I don't make myself wrong. Like, I have a little bit of shame around it. I don't like shame, but I also know that saved me. So I wouldn't be here if I hadn't done that. I'm very compassionate to myself and everybody else that we do the best that we can at the time, and it was unprecedented. I'd never experienced anything at that level, but I found it really supportive because then I had no expectations to show up for anybody else in my old life. I didn't have to be there to deal with other family dramas or stuff or friends. Like, I could just be. That was the closest that I got to living,
to live in the cave, right? In log.
I was in not on 9 acres in the base of the mountains, and I could walk across the road, and 5 minutes I was walking in state forest, and like I enjoyed the solitude. I didn't want to make friends, I did, but not many, because that's what I wanted at that time.
Yeah, that's many people describing the situation of COVID as actually a blessing with their grief, because they didn't have to socialize if they didn't want to, or not at all, or were not allowed to. So before there was this loss of marriage, which you sort of alluded to as very significant as well. And then you had this recent loss of a relationship. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that and how you dealt with the loss of your marriages?
So with my first marriage, to give a little bit of background, I was raised in a very strict sectarian Christian religion, and I was born into it, and I didn't leave until I was 31, which is around the time I met you, because that's when we started doing the journey. Well, I started doing the journey, you were already doing it. And so as I left the religion, my first husband and I, we met, when I was 19. So, and we got married at 21, 22. So,
he was also part of that religion then.
He was, yes. He's not either anymore. But so, we were like babies. We were so young when we met, and we got married within a, very, smaller mindset with, very, limited parameters. And so leaving the religion was hard. That was a loss of community and friends and everything. I mean, I literally lost all my friends, shunned me. So it was a loss of, again, my identity, like everything I'd known and thought to be true for the first 30 years of my life. I mean, that was terrifying. I spent a year in terror, literally, after I left, that religion, because my whole mind and my whole worldview and everything just crumbled, because I no longer believed this, and then felt like, well, what's the truth? I thought that was the truth, and now I don't think it is. And I had no skills and resources of how to do life and what to believe and what's true and what's not true. And I literally spent a whole year in terror. But fortunately, that's when I found, how to deal with these emotions. And so then, without the kind of, the marriage, I always say my first marriage, we were like brother and sister. We fought a lot, loved each other, but we kind of grew up together as well. But without the, he left the religion shortly after I did, but without the sort of that was the glue that held us together in a lot of ways. So then once we didn't have a religion, all the other things, problems, our marriage, came to the surface, and then it fell apart. But I still remember, I remember that was my first experience of major loss. I had lost one of my closest friends at 19. She committed suicide. But, this was like my first major relationship. I'd had kids, I had so much projections on the life, that we sort of imagined at that time that we're going to create. And I remember the day that we sat down and told my parents, and my mum particularly was quite upset. And I remember that night going to bed and we still were sleeping together even though we decided to separate. And I remember crying, and I'm not someone who's overly dramatic, but I remember crying so hard and I was in so much emotional pain that I literally felt like somebody was grabbing chunks of my skin and ripping them off my body. Like I was in that much physical pain because I was in that much emotional pain. I'd never felt something that hard and that intense. Like that was the first time I'd ever felt such an extreme emotional reaction that it was hurting my body all over, and it just felt like bits of my skin were being ripped off. So I still remember that. And it took me quite a while. Like I met Nick, the one who passed away, very shortly after that, and so we got together very quickly, and then fell pregnant accidentally, like 6 months into the relationship. And I remember, Nick was such a beautiful person with a big heart, but I was still crying over my marriage, even though I was like really, really in love with him and beautiful, and we had this amazing relationship, and I'm still like crying and grieving over this relationship. And luckily he had the capacity to hold that, both could be true and could exist simultaneously. So I was very fortunate with it. Yeah.
Wow. So looking at those different losses, what resources or insights have helped you? I mean, you said there was a mind shift after this 1 year of grieving your father and Nick, but what actually made the change? What helped you make those changes? What helped you make the mindset change?
Well, and I don't know how much you talk about the journey anymore, which is the modality that we're both trained in, and it's certainly not the only thing that I use in my therapy anymore. We're both informed in many different ways and have taken that work and made it our own. So, but I'm still going to say that was what I learned through the journey about how to be present to emotions and how to process emotions and just let them be, and just keep on dropping through the layers of emotions, and how to sit with them was still, to me, is still a foundational part of my being, and I was fortunate that I had quite a number of years of being deeply steeped in that, from my own work, but also as being a practitioner and working with others. And, even for a while I was very heavily involved in the journey community. So I was very had quite steeped in that practice, and it become very much a part of who I am, and I was embodying that. And so I think that definitely helped me just be with these excruciating experiences, just not always well, often with a lot of resistance. But at least I had that as a skill set and a mindset, and as a part of my, become a part of my way of life. So I'm very fortunate that I had that. It helped me.
And what I just thought actually prompted me to realize that the somatic experience, not the last actually, but one of the trainings that I took about trauma, is the realization that, when you said the resistance that we have, and I'm assuming resistance towards strong emotions that I see in my clients and people that I speak with, is quite natural, because it's that natural protection of the system against overwhelm. So somatic experience really talks about titration, the process in which, in physics, for example, if you mix two liquids, that if you were to mix them straight together, they would cause an explosion. But if you titrate that, so if you put drop by drop by drop, it actually emulsifies. And what I see with trauma and grief in conjunction is that people with these strong emotions, they get overwhelmed because there's such an activation in the system with the intensity of emotions, and not just one emotion, but all this that contains grief or entails grief, that there is an overwhelm in the system that makes people say, I feel like I'm going crazy. And that is the expression of it's too much, too soon to handle. And that's the definition of trauma, right? It's too much to integrate. And so it's natural for people to say, I don't want to feel that, or I can only take as much. And I mean, if you can give yourself the time to feel it in titrated increments, then it can integrate, then it can emulsify into your being, into your system, not just the body.
Yeah, I think I want to clarify that even though I said to myself, I'm going to give myself a year and then kind of pull myself together, it wasn't like, oh, that's it, my grief is over. I always, and that was one of the things that I did give myself in that mindset thing of grief will take as long as it takes. There's no, I had no concept of like trying to shut it down or make it go away, or I was just like, it's going to have its own, it's almost like its own entity. It's going to have its own evolution. And I already understood that and knew that. Because my dad died at the same time, and it was really interesting because I didn't have much time to grieve my dad before Nick died, literally 6 weeks. And his was a shock. But I found that, my dad's felt like it was a different kind of grief, and it felt more as a physical change. Like I really sort of, from cellular memory and things that I know, it felt like I'm made out of his flesh. Like the absence of him made out of his energy and flesh felt like a much more a change of my body, like a different kind of absence. Whereas Nick was like my heart and my love, my ideals and, all this kind of thing. I actually found it harder to grieve Nick, and it's taken much longer. Whereas with my dad, it felt, I don't know, like I didn't have anything also unresolved with my dad, and that was one of the things I learned really early on. And I, like, literally a month or two later, I was in Mexico and I found this thing on grief on the internet that I downloaded, and it said often grief is harder if we have unresolved issues with that person. And I found that to be so true. With my dad, it was just like, like I missed him and wished I had more time with him, but I felt so loved by him. And I loved him so much that I didn't feel like there was anything, like I felt full of him.
Complete.
I was grateful for as long as I had it with him. But with Nick, it was like there was a lot of unresolved things as well that have taken me a long time to metabolize.
Yeah, I know we could talk about even more in depth. I think this should be a longer format podcast. But in the light of time, if you were to summarize, how has your loss and trauma shaped you to where you are today? Also, like, what has your journey with loss and grief taught you?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit what I was saying at the beginning, like becoming really comfortable with that stripping away process, which is, and I mean, I am a very spiritual person, but it just feels like, it's, that expression, death by 1,000 cuts, like it's sort of like ego deaths 1,000 times, like it's just like continual ego deaths, and I think that sort of helped me. I think there's many ways to learn, and we don't have to learn just through grief and trauma and hardship. But for me, it has just felt like a continual stripping away of, life, source, God, whatever you want to call it, just going, it's not that. It's not that. It's not that. It's not that. And that's been so brutal at times that I've literally been, begging for it to stop. But now on the other side of it, that time when I said that I was nothing, and then I was kind of putting myself together and didn't want to bring back, a lot of aspects of me, I've learned to just be less, to allow the letting go, to allow the loss, to understand that really every moment is in its own way a small death, this moment's gone, this moment's gone, this moment's gone. And And also I've come to a place of being able to sit with the duality of like, oh my God, life is so precious. It's more precious to me than it's ever been. I have so much gratitude for it. And also I can be non-attached to it. You know, I can really be just present to everything and also be non-attached to it, and sitting with those two dualities. So it's been a very, very spiritual fire. It definitely has. And not everyone's going to frame it that way, and I understand, you know, everyone has their own frame for it. But for me, I'm definitely a better person for it now, and so deeply compassionate to myself and everybody else.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom. And as you know, I'm ending the podcast with the rapid fire questions. Shall we do that?
Sure.
Okay. So the first one is, grieving and trauma means?
I just think it means loss and coming to terms with loss.
And healing means?
Healing means being present and coming to a place of peace with all of life and how life shows up in its myriad forms, which does include loss and grief and death. And it's coming to a place of you don't have to like it, but it is a part of life. And yeah, you learn to sit peacefully with that as well, and deeply compassionately.
I like that. And what I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma?
Not to argue for my limitations.
Not to argue for my limitations. Say more about that.
I am much, much more resilient and stronger than I ever thought, and much humbler. I'm much better now at asking and receiving and finding resources from other people rather than being the very fiercely independent person that I was when I was younger.
Yeah. And one thing I wish people knew about loss and trauma?
That it will feel like it's going to kill you, that it is killing you. It won't. And to the best of your ability to surrender to that process of you are dying. There is a part of you that is dying as well, like everything that you know yourself to be that was wrapped up in whatever it is that you have lost. That part of you is dying, and let it.
One specific thing that has changed since my loss and trauma that I wouldn't want to miss?
This could be a whole nother podcast. You know what? My relationship to men. You know, I lost the two most important men, and it changed. And this is not something that I've addressed, and let's go briefly mention it, but it took me into a deep dive of wanting to understand men. You know, I'd spent a lot of time trying to understand the feminine, and that took me into a deep dive with my, you know, relationship with my own inner masculine, with men, you know, especially my father, and, you know, the man that I loved the most and thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. So yeah, I then went into many years of, you know, researching and understanding men and how they're different, and the love and appreciation I have for the masculine now, including my own inner masculine, is so sublime. I could talk about it for another hour, and that's what. Yeah, strangely enough, in losing the most important men, I've come to appreciate men as just the most beautiful, exquisite creatures that I did not appreciate until I lost them.
Well, thank you so much, Simone. It was a pleasure talking to you and receiving your story, and also the way that you have dealt with the many losses in your life. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. and remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.